At the Battle of Midway, American air power at sea brought forth a significant victory against the Japanese. As a result, we of course know a lot about American dive and torpedo bombers, their tactics, and also the fate of those involved, for example, the doomed flight of VT-8. But we know far less about the Japanese. Thus, let's focus on Japanese aircraft weapons and tactics to understand how the other side handled air power at sea and how successful they were. In the previous episodes, we looked at dive bombers, so now it's time for the torpedo bombers. A big thank you here goes to our friends at Dry Dock Games and JP Ferre for providing footage of their upcoming video game Task Force Admiral in this video. More information on their game at the end of the video and in the description. Now let's familiarize ourselves with Japanese torpedo bombers. These came in various shapes and sizes, but the most famous is likely the G4M Betty bomber and the B5N Kate. The Bettys were land-based attack aircraft, while the Kate was mainly used from the carriers, and it also took part in the attack on Pearl Harbor. As such, let us take the Kate as an example. The Nakajima B5N Type 97 carrier attack aircraft, called Kate by the Allies, was a single-engine three-seat torpedo bomber. The tandem seating arranged the pilot up front, followed by the navigator and bomb aimer, and finally the radio operator and gunner. The plane was powered by the Nakajima Sake 11, a 14-cylinder air-cooled radial engine with a maximum output of 1000 horsepower. Maximum speed was about 380 km per hour, cruise sat at a cheerful 260 kph. And the strike range was about 530 nautical miles. The armament of the aircraft was a single, defensive 7.7mm Type 92 machine gun. And primary armament came in two variants, either a single torpedo or a bomb load of up to 800 kilograms. Today, we will focus on the torpedo. Between 1941 to mid-1942, the Type 91 Mod 2 torpedo was the standard aerial torpedo of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It had a diameter of 17.7 inches and a length of 18 feet. Its total weight was 800 kilograms, with an explosive charge of 200 kilograms, detonated via an impact fuse set in the nose. The range was about 2,000 meters from the drop. Release altitude at the start of the war appears to have been around 300 meters, but this would go down to 100 to 50 meters as the war progressed, and there are also reports of drops as low as 5 meters. The torpedo had a speed of 41 knots. Drop speed could be fairly high, up to 480 km per hour, although of course the Kate would not reach this speed unless a very determined pilot would put her in a dive, at which point he should probably be transferred to the dive bombers. For the Kates, attack speed was likely close to 300 kph. And while I just mentioned dive bombers, do check out my video on Japanese dive bomber tactics and our 4-part series on Japanese air power with Justin Pike. Some of those videos are out already, and Patreons and channel members have early access to the remaining ones, along with a bunch of other perks. We're about ready to take a look at the tactics, but let's familiarize ourselves with the basics of Japanese formations. A three-plane formation was known as a shotai. Bombers usually flew in a more rigid Vic-type formation, unlike the shotai from the fighters. Add 3 shotai into one, and you get a chutai, and you add 2 or more chutai into one, and then you get a daitai. For torpedo bombers, a force of 2 chutai was the overall standard, while dive bombers often had a third chutai. Of course, attacks could vary from circumstance to circumstance, but we do know of various standardized patterns that the Japanese pilots practiced. Let's go through these one by one, but before that, let's look at how the torpedo was aimed in the first place. Approaching a ship, the attack would ideally be carried out with a 90-degree angle, and it should not be lower than 60 degrees from either side. The point of aim was amidships, though as an easy reference point, the bridge was to be used by the bomb aimer. If the target holds its course, the torpedo is to be dropped into the path of the vessel at a range of about 1,000 to 1,200 meters. And if the target turns away, this distance will decrease to 900 meters. And if you see the target turning into the attack, then the torpedo was to be dropped at 750 meters from the ship. Now let's go into a standard attack round before we look at the more fancy stuff. In this example, we have a Daitai composed out of 2 Chutai. It approaches the enemy fleet at an altitude of about 1,500 meters, and the Daitai will then decrease altitude to the launch altitude. Each Chutai breaks off at roughly 45-degree angles. The aim is to approach the fleet from 2 directions simultaneously, and if necessary, the planes now accelerate to the speed of about 280 to 300 kph. Once at roughly 90 degrees from the enemy fleet, the Chutai will break into individual free-plane Shotai. These turn in at set intervals in order to create some spacing to attack individual targets and to split defensive fire. The Shotai now attack high-value targets or individual targets. Now that we know what an attack would look like overall, well, let's familiarize ourselves with the tactics of a Shotai. One of these was a frontal attack, sometimes referred to by the Allies as the Anvil. The aim was to attack a single ship from multiple directions. For this, the Shotai would approach the target head-on before the left and right aircraft break off to either side. As the distance to the target decreases, the central aircraft will press on for frontal attack. And in the meantime, the 2 remaining planes turn back in to attack the target from either side at roughly 45 degrees. The target is now trapped. Continuing its course will likely result in hits, while any evasive turn to port or starboard will open it up to torpedoes launched from the opposite side. A successful anvil attack can be considered as the surest way to take on an enemy ship, but the timing, range, and distance estimation of each flight had to be the exact for it to work, which of course made it incredibly difficult. As such, it was more common for a Shotai to attack from one single direction, perhaps with the attempt to coordinate the attack with another Shotai from the opposite direction to have a similar effect. Another type of attack was a column approach. A flight would set up in column and fly on a course that is set to pass the target almost diagonally, and then it would swing in and drop torpedoes one after the other. I have not found any information showing how effective this approach was. My estimation is that this approach was meant to surprise and confuse the enemy vessel, make it unclear to them who exactly attacked, when and how many torpedoes are in the water, and at the same time, the column formation could also quickly turn into a line astern for a more conventional approach. Finally, we have the nighttime torpedo attack. For this, the formation would be accompanied by Betty bombers, which were tasked to find the enemy fleet. Once found, they were tasked then to illuminate the target by laying a V-like flare pattern behind the fleet. This would silhouette the ships against a bright background, and the torpedo run would be conducted by all planes from one single attack direction. The question is now, how successful were Japanese torpedo attacks? This is difficult to answer, although we of course know of various high-profile incidents like the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse. I do have some data here from the Striking Power of Airborne Weapons document, which is a period source, but overall it is a limited data pool. I could not really find a comprehensive and detailed statistics, either in books or period documents, that detail close to all ships sunk by the Type 91 aerial torpedo, so all military and transport ships from all nations and so on. The historians that I asked didn't know either, and in the words of one respondent, open quote, "Everybody is very happy to say that Japanese aircraft sank a lot of Allied ships, but it seems nobody made statistics." End quote. Perhaps I'm missing something, it is always possible, and if you know of a comprehensive list, and I do expect there to be at least one partial one, shows a bit more than the one I have, that must exist somewhere, please share it in the comments or reach out directly. Anyway, my data comes from a document called Striking Power of Airborne Weapons, and it evaluates the sinking rate of sunk ships. This is not a complete list, but it gives us an overall idea. For small destroyers hit by one torpedo, 12 out of 16 were sunk. Those hit by 2 torpedoes, all of them sank. For larger destroyer, the ratio for one torpedo hit was 1 out of 6 sunk, and 1 out of 1 sunk for 2 hits. For light cruisers, 3 ships that got hit once were not sunk, and 1 out of 1 were sunk with 2 hits. Cruisers, 10 were hit by a single torpedo with none of them sunk, 4 were hit twice, In 2 cases, torpedoes and gunfire contributed to the sinking of 2 cruisers, hit 3 times or more, both of them sank. And then we have carriers. 4 were hit once, none of those were sunk. 1 out of 3 sank following 2 hits. 1 survived 3 hits, and 2 were hit by 4 or more torpedoes, and those both sank. And then, of course, battleships, well, the list does get a bit tricky here. They include the Pearl Harbor ones, which got mullered by both torpedoes and bombs, so I'm not going to include them here. But let's go briefly back to the carriers. The Japanese actually expected that about 7 torpedo hits were needed to sink a carrier, and that about 1/3 of the full strength of the attacking force would be lost during an attack. The United States Navy assumption was that 4 Japanese torpedo hits would have a 90% chance to sink a carrier, which decreases to 2 hits in terms of escort carriers, but do note that this assumption was made with an assumed yield, or warhead yield, of 50% higher than the aerial torpedo we actually looked at. So based on this conclusion that the United States Navy had, the Japanese figure of 7 torpedo hits per carrier is actually far higher than what was necessary during World War II. In any case, in a broad comparison to dive bombing, torpedo hits, for now, appear more destructive, but the price one pays for that is being exposed to far more enemy fighter attacks and, of course, AA defenses. And we see examples of this with American torpedo attacks, for example at the Battle of Midway with VT-8, or of course on the Japanese side at the action of Bougainville, to name one. Both videos are linked in the description. I want to end this video with a shout out to our friends at Task Force Admiral, a new World War II Pacific Theater based video game that has just launched its Kickstarter campaign. I've been following the development for a while and have been interacting with the developers as well for years. In fact, in the past they provided some of the footage that you saw in videos, like the one on the action of Bougainville. I believe that Task Force Admiral could not be developed by a better team. They know their history and how carriers and fleets were managed during World War II. That's why I also agreed to contribute with some aircraft articles that you will find then in the final game. Task Force Admiral is set out to become a fantastic command and control management experience for the player. You get to be in charge for a United States Navy task force during 1941 to 1943 as you take on the Japanese Navy. And after trying it, I am really excited to see the finished product. In the future, it also seems that they want to expand the experience beyond the scope of the first package, so check out the Kickstarter with the link in the description. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and see you in the sky.